Ladies and gentlemen, welcome into chapter number 7 of our Principles of Management DMAC course. Today, we get into individual and group decision making. In our chapter, we take a look at a few types of decision making models that managers use when making the day-to-day decisions, the medium-term decisions, and the long-term decisions of their companies and what is the best direction for those companies to go in. So we're going to go ahead and get right into it. So this week, a little bit longer in terms of the learning objectives. However, if you take a look at the chapter really, in terms of page length, is not as steep as you might think with 8 learning objectives. So 8 learning objectives this week, meaning 24 questions for your projects. All right, so when we take a look here at two kinds of decision making, we have the rational type of decision making, and then we also have the non-rational type of decision making, and we're going to break both of those down here. The rational decision making model is managers should make logical and optimal decisions, which, if you're sitting there listening to this, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, no kidding, Sorensen. Obviously, we should be, making the most logical and optimal decisions to better our business and to carry our business forward. But however, we all know that, that doesn't necessarily always end up happening with businesses. And we'll talk a little bit about why the rational decision-making model is not necessarily always the most accurate or necessarily the best when we as we go along here. But there are 4 steps to the rational decision-making model, and those stages there you can see in your slideshow. So stage 1, identify the problem or opportunity, determine the actual versus the desirable. Okay, so what is potentially our issue with the company, or on the flip side, if you want to look at a more positive scope, what are opportunities out there for us as a business? Is there an opportunity for a new product line? Is there an opportunity to expand? Is there an opportunity to upscale our operations? Is there, opportunities out there to make revenues and profits that are within our grasp? And with that, in that stage 1, talks about determining the actual versus the desirable. And really, I think we kind of, we could think about there and say, well, it's desirable to have, lots of money. However, in the actuality of it, our situations may not be exactly quite like that. So you actually have to, when taking a look at this stage, figure out what is your actual situation versus what is the desirable situation. And then after we've kind of figured that out, what's the problem, what's the opportunity, what's the situation, then we can move to stage 2. And stage 2 is think up alternative solutions, both the obvious and the creative. So with this, if you have a revenue problem where you're not bringing in enough sales, right? And sales is really your focus. Well, an obvious solution to falling sales, falling revenues would be to lower the price. If you lower the price, demand's likely to increase, thus bringing up, your amount of sales. However, raising the price and increasing your revenue does not necessarily mean you're always increasing your profit, right? So, you have to kind of take that with a grain of salt when, thinking up your alternative decision. So, an obvious one there would be lowering the prices. However, a creative one might be, and you guys know me as not the most creative in the world, but if you're trying to drum up more revenue, maybe some sort of punch card where, after 10 purchases you get, a free drink or a free meal or, something like that, where you don't really necessarily have to lower your prices, but you kind of get the people engaged with potentially something free if they make enough purchases, right? So, one obvious, maybe one a little bit more creative. So you have to think up of alternative solutions, multiple ways to attack a problem or an opportunity. Step 3, evaluate the alternatives and select a solution. Okay. And with this, when we ultimately select our alternative, make a decision, we have to consider the ethics of the situation. So we'll talk a little bit more about ethics in this chapter, but ethically speaking, is anybody at the risk of harm? Is anything potentially illegal happening? Are we doing right by our staff? Are we doing right by our customers? So any decision that we make, we need to consider the ethics involved. Then we have to figure out the feasibility. And when we talk about feasibility, we are simply talking about, is what we are deciding to do, can this actually happen? Is this something that if we implement this plan, we are logically going to be able to execute this sort of strategy? And then finally, the effectiveness. If we do this, if we do a problem here, if we implement a strategy, is it ultimately going to be effective? So going back to lowering prices versus a 10 punch card where you buy 10 and you get one free. So you may find that lowering prices could be effective for revenue gaining because you're going to increase your revenue. However, it may not be very feasible to do it in the long term because it doesn't lead to higher profits. And some cases, you may actually be losing money, right? So in this case, it could be effective for the business. However, feasibly, it will not keep the business in business for all that long. And assuming we're talking price, on the surface, there's probably no ethical violations. On the surface level, depending on the industry, we could get a little bit more into some of the ethics there with pricing. But in this simplistic example, probably no ethical dilemma going on. Or then our our next idea, which was the punch hole, which was the 10 punch card, where if you buy 10, you get one free. This one could definitely be more feasible in that it increases revenue without really taking a bite out of our profits. However, some people may not, buy enough to view 10 punch card worth actually increasing the demand of the product, right? So while it's feasible, it could be, may not be very effective. And then, the ethics of it, the ethics of the situation, say, hypothetically, there's, multiple people using the same punch card, right? How would you potentially deal with an ethical situation like that? So you have to kind of consider maybe some different ethics situations along in that stage 3. And then step 4, implement and evaluate the solution chosen, right? So then ultimately, you decide on lowering the revenue, you implement lower prices across the board, and then, you run with that scenario, and then all of a sudden, okay, we, evaluate it. We made more sales, however, profits are down because we lowered our prices, right? Or we lowered the prices enough to where people are just really, really buying, and we've all of a sudden taken a different pricing strategy where we can actually keep our prices low and demand is going to actually spike to make it worth it, right? So those are our 4 stages of rational decision making. But then we take a look at what is actually wrong with the rational decision making model. And really, with the rational decision making model, there are 3 items that are a problem when it comes to the rational decision making model. And those rational decision making models here, and we've gone through quite a few slides here in terms of the different stages. So I encourage you. We really spent a lot of time here taking a look at these slides and kind of talking through them. So I definitely encourage you to look at slides 5 through 9 here in terms of the 4 stages that we just broke down. But then we go to slide 10 here, and these really become our 3 issues with the rational decision making model. So the first assumption of the rational decision making model is complete information and no uncertainty within the marketplace. So you should be able to obtain complete error-free info about all alternative courses of action and the consequences that would follow from each choice. Okay. So I want you to think about this for a moment. How often in the business world are we operating with complete information and no uncertainty? Think about that. And then see why we have an issue with the rational decision model, right? There's always some level of uncertainty within the business world, within the business environment. Then the second one, we have a logical, unemotional analysis. So having no prejudice or emotional blind spots, you are able to logically evaluate the alternatives, ranking them from best to worst according to your personal preferences. Think about that. How often are we dealing with a strictly logical and unemotional business environment? And now think about why that could be an issue with the rational decision making model, right? So we all know that humans are emotional beings. They don't necessarily always act with emotional balance or even the most logical in a lot of scenarios and situations, right? So this can be very problematic for businesses when just trying to strictly approach the rational decision model. And then the third one there, the best decision for the organization. Confident of the best future course of action, you coolly choose the alternative that you believe will be the most that will most benefit the organization. And again, we don't always do that because it's not necessarily always one, the right decision being made, and two, sometimes these decisions can be made under strict very stressful situations, and sometimes it's the ideas are made in the mindset of actually protecting the business in the short term. So you have really three assumptions with the rational model that ultimately end up working against the rational model as the ideal for the business. Not to say in practice we would love to be able to execute these. It's just very difficult in the business world to execute that strategy given those three assumptions. All right. So then we take a look here at the non-rational decision making. Managers find it difficult to make optimal decisions. All right. So we have thinking about it for a second, well, we have this rational model, and this rational model is excellent, right? It would be easy to just simply take a look at all the data, make the decisions that are best for the company. However, we don't always have that luxury. We don't always have the luxury to make those decision makings, have that rational decision making model. So ultimately, a lot of times we have non-rational decision making. So managers find it difficult to make those optimal decisions. And here are just some hindrances that can help, or not really help, but hinder, not help, rather the decision making process. So complexity. So the problems that need solving are often exceedingly complex and beyond understanding. We have time and money constraints. There's not enough time and there's not enough money to gather all of the information needed. We have different cognitive capacities, values, skills, habits, and unconscious reflexes. So managers are not all built the same way, of course, and we have personal limitations and biases that affect their judgment. Then we have imperfect information. So managers have imperfect, fragmentary information about the alternatives and their consequences. Okay. Again, in the business world, very difficult to have that perfect set of information. Then we have information overload, too much information for one person to process. And then not only can it be too much to process, but then figuring out which information is relevant versus not relevant can become very problematic. And then different priorities. So some data considered more important, certain facts are ignored. So that's that idea of, what is important to one manager may not be important to another manager. And then that leads into our last one there with conflicting goals. Other managers, including colleagues, have conflicting goals. And a lot of times that can fall back on the idea that the data that they look at, somebody, considers it to be more important than, another colleague, right? Or there are other ulterior motives in the business world that can hinder decision making, right? So the business world, too often we find ourselves in the non-rational decision making model where managers are really trying to battle all of these hindrances in the workplace in order to try and be successful. So we really have the non-rational models of decision making are how managers make those decisions. So these models assume the decision making is nearly always uncertain and risky. making it difficult for managers to make optimal decisions. The non-rational models are descriptive rather than prescriptive. They describe how managers actually make decisions rather than how they should. So two rational models are the satisficing and the intuition. So we have bounded rationality, and with our bounded rationality, here, try this again. There we go. With our bounded rationality, so this is the concept that suggests the ability of decision makers to be rational is limited by the numerous constraints, such as the ones that we just discussed. Hubris, which we define as an extreme, inflated sense of pride, certainty, and confidence. So this one can also get in the way of decision making. And then we have a satisficing model. So this is the model where managers seek alternatives until they find one that is satisfactory, not optimal, right? And unfortunately, in the business world today, we deal with a lot of that. We're looking at the models that are going to be the most satisfactory and not necessarily the most optimal. So that is one of the two non-rational models. That is the satisficing model, where we're just looking for the most satisfactory position. All right, and then we have the intuition model. All right, it just feels right. It's also known as going with your gut. All right, so that's the intuition. So this is making the choice without conscious thought or logical inference. Intuition that stems from expertise, a person's explicit tacit knowledge about a person, situation, an object, or a decision opportunity is known as a histolic or a holistic punch, not histolic, holistic punch. Intuition based on feelings. All right. It is the involuntary emotional response to those same matters. It's also known as an automated experience, right? So when the intuition model, if you've ever heard that term, going with your gut, this is the intuition model. We're not necessarily relying on outside information. We are simply relying on our gut. What has worked for us in the past, and how are we going to use that stuff that helped us in the past? How are we going to help us moving forward? Okay, so that is the holistic approach, the holistic hunch, as it were, to decision making, where it is really going based off of our gut. Okay, now we kind of take a switch here. We kind of take a look from decision making. So, we had the rational decision making model, where in a perfect world, that's the one that managers would use every time. We figure out, there are, really three issues with the rational decision making model. So then that gets us put into this non-rational decision making model, where it's two places where we're using fragments of data to get us a satisfactory outcome, and sometimes we're using intuition. We're using our gut to make decisions based on our expertise and our past experience. So that kind of wraps up 7.1 in sort of a nutshell. And then we kind of move here to 7.2, where all of a sudden we're looking more at making ethical decisions. So, and we look here at the dismal record of business ethics. So, and then a roadmap to ethical decision making, a decision tree. So we're going to take a look here on the decision making here. And if you look at your graph, there is a graph here on page 276 in your book. You see that according to a recent study of top CEOs departures, among the largest reasons for people leaving is unethical behavior. And it's really shot up there in the last 20, it looks like 2018 was the last time they polled, but it's really shot up there from 2016 to 2018, where unethical behavior has really become an issue, not become an issue, but it's really becoming a leading cause of why CEOs are leaving their company. And, there's 5 reasons that suggest why CEO firings are happening due to ethical lapses. So, 1, the public is less forgiving of poor behavior by executives. I think you're starting to, not really starting to see that, but we're coming up in an era now where unethical behavior rather, is certainly less forgiving than it was, 15, 20 years ago. Regulations are becoming more stringent in terms of what can and cannot happen uh, with CEOs and their conduct in the workplace. Number three, companies are expanding operations into developing countries where ethical risks may be higher and laws may be less protective. So, of course, when companies go multinational, they are expected to abide by the rules of that country, and sometimes ethical behavior, that may result in a fine or a firing here in the United States could potentially, end up with jail time in another country. So that is another reason why companies certainly have to buckle down and understand, just the severity of what some of these ethical violations could be in other nations. And then we have four, digital communications increase exposure to risk from both hackers and whistleblowers. So with that, anything, email correspondence, text messages, so on and so forth. If, you have players, in your company, high ranking officials that are partaking in unethical behavior, there is greater opportunity now for security breaches within that, where hackers, whistleblowers can obtain that, and release that data to the public, and then ultimately that usually causes a firing or or a resignation. And then the fifth reason is the 24/7 news cycle and the proliferation of media in the 21st century amplifies negative information in real time. So again, kind of going on with, you're under a microscope more than ever as a CEO, as a high ranking official in the business world. So any information that can be, deemed as, unethical now gets held up by the news organizations. The 24/7 news cycle, you have pundits coming on and talking about it, and now all of a sudden, this, depending on the severity of the charge, it could end up being in the news cycle for 3, 5 days, a week potentially. That becomes really, really hard to survive if you're a CEO, because ultimately businesses, there's only so much bad publicity that businesses can handle. So that can be a real issue there. So some different examples in your book. I encourage you to look at some of those different examples of ethical lapses. So pharmaceuticals pricing, that's always a hot button issue with the with the pricing of potentially life-saving prescription meds. Behavioral examples, so you think about the Me Too movement, that's brought down a lot of prominent CEOs. But ultimately too, there are positives in terms of ethics. So a lot of philanthropy done by a lot of billionaires also is used to gain goodwill from the people. All right. So, a roadmap to ethical decision making. And so we call this a decision tree. And so a decision tree is a graph of decisions and their possible consequences. It is used to create a plan to reach a goal. Decision trees are used to aid in making decisions, especially when there is uncertainty. So, when confronted with any proposed action for which a decision is required, a manager works through the decision tree and asks the following questions. So, is the action legal? If yes, does the action maximize shareholder value? If it's a yes, is the proposed action ethical? If no, would it be efficient to take the would it be efficient or excuse me, ethical, efficient, holy moly. Would it be ethical not to take the proposed action? So this is the decision tree that a lot of managers nowadays have to go through when making those decisions. And I shouldn't even really say nowadays. A lot of managers, have gone through similar decision making trees in the past. It's now just such an amplified idea here, especially as we've gotten into the 2010s and so on. It's really become an issue that has gathered a lot of viewing and a lot of interest from the outside. So it's from the outsiders of an organization. So it's important for these managers to really be very selective with the decisions that they make. And then we have figure 7.4. So ethical decision tree, what's the right thing to do? And here's the example of that. And I think if you take a look on page 278 in your book, you can actually see the ethical decision making tree there a little bit more in depth. And that really covers it there for 7.2. So as we switch gears from ethical decision making for a little bit, now we take a look at evidence-based decision making and data analytics. So we take a look at evidence-based decision making um, in praise of data analytics. So we'll take a look at data analytics, and then we'll take a look at big data, what it is, and how it is used. So really the big picture here. So this section describes the 7 principles for implementing evidence-based data. We also describe why it is hard to bring this approach to bear on one's firm's making. Finally, we take a look at data analytics and big data and use all of their levels of an organization. So we kind of shift from there. We kind of take a look at the evidence-based decision making. So here are the 7 implementation principles. So number 1, treat your organization as an unfinished prototype. So leaders need to act as if their organization is unfinished. They won't be ruined by a dangerous new idea, or it's not impossible to change because of employee or management resistance, right? So treat your organization like an unfinished prototype. No brag, just facts. So leaders shouldn't make over-the-top assertions about forthcoming products. They should simply use the available resources to make effective decisions. Number 3, see yourself and your organization as outsiders. So most managers are afflicted with the rampant optimism, so inflated views of their own talents and prospects for success, which causes them to downplay the risks and continue a path despite evidence that things are not working. So, see yourself and your organization as outsiders do. So, basically don't buy the hype would be a good example of that. Number 4, evidence-based management is not just for senior executives. So the best organizations are those in which everyone, not just top managers, are guided by the responsibility to gather and to act quantitative and qualitative data and share the results with others. Step 5, like everything you see, you still need to sell it. Unfortunately, new exciting ideas grab attention even when they are vastly inferior to old ideas. All right. So, that just goes to say sometimes, new doesn't necessarily mean better. So ultimately you have to, have good products, have, new product or, good new products, not just new products. Ultimately you have to have those new products that solve the problem. Number 6, if all else fails, slow the spread of bad practice. So because many managers, employees face pressures to do things that are known to be ineffective, it may be necessary for you to practice evidence misbehavior. That is, ignore orders you know to be wrong or delay their implementation. Okay, so stopping the spread of bad practice within your organization. And then number 7, the best diagnostic question: what happens when people fail? So failure hurts, it's embarrassing, but we would rather live without it. The author writes in our book here. So ultimately it can be difficult, to admit failure, to admit problems, but ultimately, that's how organizations, get better and are able to move forward with their practices and with their businesses. I think we've seen a lot of, organizations out there fail at stuff and ultimately come back, bigger, stronger, and I think, there just has to be something that's said about, not being afraid to fail, in an organizational setting. It's painful. We don't like to do it, but ultimately it can be very effective for the growth of a business. All right. So then after evidence-based management, we take a look at the praise of data analytics. Data analytics is increasingly done with specialized systems and software. Some leaders and firms have become exceptional practitioners of data analytics. So perhaps the purest application of evidence-based management is the use of data analytics, which is the process of analyzing broad data sets in order to make conclusions about the information that they contain. And, really one of the places that you see data analytics, is sports in terms of, you see it a lot in the NBA in the NBA now, where a lot of teams, they don't really take 2 point jump shots anymore. They actually have really gone to the opposite ends of the extreme, where you're not, the data shows that the best sort of efficient offense is really to either try and get layups and dunks as easy as possible, or shoot a 3 pointer. And the NBA has gotten to it's a stretch in this era where teams are now built based upon those data analytics and those assumptions. You either better be able to shoot the three ball, or you better be able to get to the rim for easy layups and dunks. Otherwise, you don't really serve a huge purpose in the NBA unless you're an exceptional defensive player. So data analytics is pervasive throughout our entire world, not just necessarily the business world, but it's using data in a lot of different places in order to be most effective. So um, moving forward here, so big data. So what is it? How is it used? So big data is stores of data so vast that conventional database management systems cannot handle them. So this big data is information collected on customers, on different businesses, and when used properly, it can be used to drive decisions in business that can help them optimize client satisfaction, optimize profits, optimize their human resource practices in terms of people to hire. What are the best practices to implement within a business in terms of how to improve their employees' performance, how to improve their company's performance. It enhances production efficiency. So when we talk about production efficiency, how can we, when we're manufacturing goods, how can we most effectively produce them? What are the best production techniques that we can use to produce products more efficiently? Advanced health and medical information is another example of how big data can help. So using, this can help, doctors, believe it or not, with their decision making on how to best treat patients. Um, Aiding in public policy in terms of, you know, how politicians make their decisions in terms of having information and data on some of the issues that face this country, and then using big data up and down the hierarchy. And when we talk about using it up and down the hierarchy, we simply mean that lowest level, top level, middle level, how is data being used. And if you take a look on page 285 in your book, you can actually see at what managerial level the data is being used, and how really big data can be used at that certain level of management. All right, and then we take a look as we talk about big data and big data sets. We move into 7.4 here, and this one, we're living in an increasingly interesting time for this one, so it's probably appropriate that it gets brought up. But artificial intelligence and it being a powerful resource in decision making, and we're going to take a look at types of AI, AI's benefits, AI's drawbacks, and these machines, they're called autonomous devices because they collect data from situations to make calculations, define probabilities, and make reason-based decision according to the program goals. And so they rely on artificial intelligence, which is the ability of a computer system to perform the tasks that normally require human intelligence. So some of the types of AI that we have. So you may think of it as revolutionize the ways we do business, but thinking behind AI has honestly gone back thousands of years. So different types of AI. We have the automated business processes. So the most common type of AI is the automation of digital and physical tasks. So this is primarily achieved through robotic process automation, RPA, which is when robots act like humans, inputting and extracting information. Then we have data analysis. So data analysis can be used to detect patterns in vast volumes of data and interpret their meaning. So predictive analytics is a category of data analysis that makes predictions about the future outcomes based on historical data and analytic techniques. And then we have engaging customers and employees. So companies can use AI to more closely engage employees and consumers. This includes use of chatbots and intelligent agents to provide 24/7 customer service or for tasks such as password resets, technical support questions, and product service. So you guys have probably dealt with AI in that way in terms of resetting passwords, tech support, questions or issues about products or services. We've talked about Chat GPT before, in terms of its value and how that's really changed the game in terms of how people can really, education is just one way of how Chat GPT can really affect how education is done in terms of papers, right? So you guys have definitely are living through this sort of AI revolution that is taking place right now. So AI benefits. So AI will transform the world as we know it, and I think again the 2020s especially are going to be a big era. I think a big decade for AI, and whether or not that's good, bad, or indifferent, we'll get to, ultimately we'll get to see. So humans could be relieved of some of their drudgery, some of the drudgery of work, and even some of the time commitment that today's jobs often require. So AI, it could be one of those deals where some AIs, will work to actually eliminate some of the jobs out there. Just one simplistic example is you're seeing like self checkout, artificial intelligence used there, to kind of replace what a human did for so long. Organizations continues to use AI to develop a competitive advantage. You've seen that with Chat GPT, and now you've seen now with Microsoft. They have enabled Chat GPT to work with their search engine Bing in an effort to gain a competitive advantage over Google, right? So this is not a foreign concept to us where we're, using AI to get an upper hand on competitors. This is something that you're going to continue to see. And then enhanced decision making. So is a thematic benefit of AI. So, using artificial intelligence to guide the decisions, and if we're going to be completely honest, going back to, rational decision making, ultimately AI is going to try and push us in that direction of no longer are we going to have to deal on non-rational decision making models. We can actually make a move towards the rational and decision making models, and the AI being able to use perfect information to help guide decisions. So it's really a fascinating proposition that you're seeing play out over the 2020s. Now the drawbacks, and there are drawbacks. So implementation, so that's the most cited challenge of it. Experts believe it's due to the newness of the technology and low levels of experienced on the job learning. Okay, so being able to just use the AI properly has proved to be difficult. Data issues, so data access and integration. So it's important for companies to provide access to be credible. That's not always an easy task. So AI makes this challenging and more complex. Cost, it's not cheap. Um, when they say here 6,000 to more than 300,000 for AI software, those can be it can be a very expensive endeavor. Weaponizing AI has also its fair share of critics because it's dangerous, the dangers it can pose to society. um, yeah, I think we're gonna have to find through the decade we're gonna have some rules with AI, and ultimately are is every individual going to follow those rules remains to be seen, right? So I think the weaponizing of AI is probably the one of the biggest fears that you see out there in terms of people thinking about the drawbacks of artificial intelligence. And then you know one last disadvantage or drawback is the human replacement. Will AI replace us? That's it's another huge potential disadvantage for us. So allowing those machines to become smarter actually may threaten us. It's the example of the Terminator movies where I think there's some fear out there that if we're not careful, we could turn into it could turn into the real life Terminator. which you don't obviously want to see. 7.5 here. You can take a look at some of the benefits of AI. You can find that on page 289 in your book. Take a look at some of those benefits. All right. Now, as we switch gears here into 7.5, we take a look at the 4 general decision-making styles. So decision-making style reflects the combination of how an individual perceives and responds to information. A team of researchers developed a model of decision-making based on the idea that styles vary along 2 different dimensions: value orientation and then the tolerance for ambiguity. So the value orientation, tolerance for ambiguity. So our 4 styles. We have the directive style, so action-oriented decision makers who focus on facts. We have the analytical style, careful decision makers who like lots of information and alternative choices. Then we have conceptual style, so decision makers who rely on intuition and have a long-term perspective. And then we have the behavioral style, so the most people-oriented decision makers of the bunch. So the value orientation and the tolerance for ambiguity. So the value orientation. So some people are very task focused at work and do not pay much attention to people issues, whereas others are just the opposite. So that's the value orientation. And then we have ambiguity, so the need for structure or control of one's life. So a high need for control or structure means a low tolerance for ambiguity, and a low need for control or structure means a high tolerance for ambiguity. So, one way to think about ambiguity is that term we call gray area, right? So gray area where, there's some question marks, there's not necessarily a lot of control. So if you're a person who has a high tolerance for ambiguity, high tolerance for gray area, that means you have a low need for control or structure. And, businesses, people, are different in how they act with those needs. So value orientations, refers to the extent to which a person focuses on either task and technical concerns or people and social concerns when making a decision. And then, we see how, ambiguity can play, a factor as well. So we have really those 2 forces, kind of weighing, heavily on our decision making. So our decision making style. So when you take a look here, and you can also see this in your book on page 292. So decision making style. So we have our tolerance for ambiguity. So, and then we have our values orientation. So, you can see how, an individual and how the boxes play out. So, a high tolerance for ambiguity, but a, low focus on values in terms of tasks and technical orient concerns. And I shouldn't say a low focus, but, if you're more individual focused on tasks and technical concerns with a high tolerance for ambiguity, you are an analytical decision maker. If you have a low tolerance for ambiguity and you have a focus on task and technical concerns, you are a directive decision maker. And then if you have high tolerance for ambiguity, but you're more focused on people and social concerns, you are a conceptual decision maker. Whereas if you have a low tolerance for ambiguity and a high, not really a high, but a more personal and social concern individual, then you are a behavioral decision maker. So the 4 types of decision makers can really fit neatly onto this decision-making style continuum. So the directive style, so action-oriented decision makers who focus on facts. So people with directive styles have a low tolerance for ambiguity and are oriented towards task and technical concerns in the making of decisions. They are efficient, logical, practical, and systematic in their approach to solving problems, and they are action-oriented and decisive and like to focus on the facts. So one example in the book, does a really great job of providing some examples. But Terry Jimenez, he's the CEO of the New York Daily News, Chicago Tribune, Baltimore Sun newspaper. So he fits this pattern in this example. So the move from print to digital media means newspapers need to make difficult cuts in order to stay alive. And Jimenez does not shy away from making difficult decisions. His newspapers cut their editorial staff in half in 2018, and he initiated additional cuts at the executive level in 2020. So that would be an example of a directive style of manager, focusing on facts. And then our analytical style, so careful decision makers who like lots of information and alternative choices. So these individuals have a much higher tolerance for ambiguity and respond well to new or uncertain situations. Analytical managers like to consider more information and alternatives than those adopting the directive style. They are careful decision makers who take longer to make decisions, but they also tend to overanalyze the situation. Ursula Burns, she was the CEO of Xerox, so she was famously asking subordinates to poke holes in her ideas and provide alternative choices. This also ensured her advisors come from diverse backgrounds so they could provide her with different perspectives. The conceptual style, so decision makers who rely on intuition have a long-term perspective. So people with a conceptual style have a high tolerance for ambiguity, tend to focus on the people or social aspects of a work situation, and they have a broad perspective to problem solving and like to consider many options and future possibilities. The conceptual types adopt a long-term perspective and rely on intuition and discussions with others to acquire information. They are also willing to take risks and are good at finding creative solutions to problems. So Disney's former CEO, and this book shows a little bit of its age here. Bob Iger, he's now actually the CEO of Disney once again. So according to colleagues, Iger, who led the company from 2005 to February of 2020, which is now he's back in power, forged trust with business partners, even former adversaries. Excuse me. He was also known for taking risks in order to propel the company forward. So this included the purchase of Star Wars, 20th First Century Fox, and then the construction of additional theme parks and the launch of the Disney Plus streaming service. So Bob Iger, an individual, he retired right before the pandemic in 2020. Some would argue he had excellent timing because he got out, almost at peak Disney. But then about 2 years later, a little over 2 years later, he was invited back to become CEO of Disney once again, because Disney has kind of struggled since the beginning of the pandemic, in all honesty. And you're seeing things like Disney Plus, even though it's very popular with the customer base, it's not exactly a money maker. Not a lot of money in streaming, to be honest with you. So Bob Iger is kind of charged with righting the ship, as it were, with Disney at the moment. All right, and then we have the behavioral style. So the behavioral style is the most people-oriented of the four styles. People with this style work well with others and enjoy social interactions in which opinions are openly exchanged. Behavioral types are supportive. They are receptive to suggestions, show warmth, prefer verbal to written information. And although they like to hold meetings, some people with this style have a tendency to avoid conflict and be overly concerned about others. This can lead them to adopt a wishy-washy approach to decision-making and have a hard time saying no. So Larry Sutton, CEO of the R&R Tire Express, is a good example. He believes that employees need to be fully served and valued, so they in turn serve customers. He doesn't take himself too seriously and connects with his employees on a personal level and will even clean his store's bathrooms when needed. So what style do you have as an individual? So, when taking a look at what style do you have? So first one is know thyself. So awareness of your style assists you in identifying your strengths and weaknesses as a decision maker, facilitates the potential for self-improvement. As we mentioned earlier, studies confirm that personalities dimensions also impact on decision-making tendencies. This means reflecting on your personality will gain additional insight into your decision-making style. Influencing others. So you can increase your ability to influence others by being aware of decision-making styles, For example, if you're dealing with an analytical person, you should provide as much information as possible to support your ideas. And then it can also help you deal with conflict. So knowledge of styles gives you an awareness of how people can take the same information yet arrive at different decisions by using a variety of decision-making strategies. Different decision-making styles are one likely source of interpersonal conflict at work. So the better you can understand your style and the style of those around you, the better you can work to deal with conflict within your organization. All right, so decision-making biases, and let me be clear. There are a lot of them, 10 of them, in fact, that we take a look. So 10 common decision-making biases or rules of thumb. So here we go. We're going to go through these. So availability bias. So is the use of information readily available from memory to make judgments. So the information that you can recall the best is availability bias. Representativeness bias, so the tendency to generalize from a small sample or a single event. Confirmation bias, so this occurs when people seek information to support their viewpoint and then discount the data that does not support it. And then we have the sunk cost bias, so money already spent seems to justify continuing, all right, meaning it's too costly to simply abandon it when the information suggests, yeah, let's go in a different direction. And then we have the anchoring and adjustment bias. So that's being influenced by an initial figure. So it's a tendency to make decisions based off of, an initial dollar figure in terms of cost or maybe potential profit. So we anchor ourselves to that decision. And then 6 through 10. So overconfidence bias. So really, you can say it's blind to your own blindness. So the bias in which people's subjective confidence in their decision making is greater than their objective accuracy. Hindsight bias is the tendency of people to view events from as more predictable than they really are. Framing bias. So this is the tendency of decision makers to be influenced by the way a situation or problem is presented to them. Escalation of commitment bias. So this occurs when decision makers increase their commitment despite a negative information about it. And then the categorical thinking bias, sorting information into buckets. And I think there are some really, good examples. If you take a look at your book, pages 298 or 295, 295 to 297, I'd encourage you to read up on some of those different biases out there. I think there are some pretty good examples in terms of what we mean when talking about those. Group decision making. So as we kind of move forward here, as we get towards our end, so group decision making. Advantages and advantages of group decision making. We'll take a look at groupthink. We'll take a look at characteristics of group decision making, group problem solving techniques, reaching for consensus, and then more group problem solving techniques here as we look to wrap up this lecture. So advantages and disadvantages. So advantages, obviously, greater pool of knowledge, the different perspectives, the intellectual stimulation, the better understanding of decision rationale, and then the deeper commitment to the decision. These are all decision-making advantages that can play out. Obviously, I think working on teams throughout your, schooling careers, I think you can probably resonate with some of these advantages. But then we have the disadvantages. So disadvantages, a few people dominate or intimidate. So I'm sure you've all been a part of groups where, some of the people are very much like, this is how we're going to do it. It is simply going to be my way or the highway. Groupthink, which we'll talk a little bit more here. So that's when they all agree just for the sake of, being unanimous. You really don't accurately assess this, the situation, the decision. There's a positive team spin, and it really works against sound judgment. It's really just kind of what we call an echo chamber. You're just, you're really just trying to, get out of there. You're just trying to be a consensus. Satisficing. So, this is, because most people would just as soon cut a meeting short. So the tendency is to seek a decision that is good enough rather to push on possible solutions. So it's one of those satisfactory decisions, but not optimal. And then goal displacement. And goal displacement, groups working, and really honestly getting off track in terms of what should the primary goal be, you know within the work team, and then ultimately getting put off task, put off track, by that situation. Then we have groupthink. So cohesiveness isn't always good. So this results when a group of team members think, are friendly, tightly knit, but unable to really think outside the box. This results in groupthink, and it can conclude in failure to consider new information and loss of new ideas. So some of the symptoms of groupthink: so sense of invulnerability, rationalizations, dominant members. So, one individual, maybe two individuals, really stifling the rest of the group. Peer pressure is another example. That illusion of unanimity, where everybody's unanimous, or the illusion of everybody being unanimous. However, really they're just being peer pressured into agreeing. And then what we call the wisdom of the crowd. So, this leads members with different ideas to censor themselves, because it is opposite of the wisdom of the collective. And that can ultimately, obviously, we know that, although ultimately we know that the crowd is not necessarily always correct. So how can we prevent groupthink? We can allow criticism, okay, and it doesn't necessarily have to, not necessarily, but it doesn't have to be personal criticism. It really just needs to be constructive in how a business, how an idea or how a group process works through their process. Allow for other perspectives, and then ultimately we can reflect before entering a group decision. These are ways that we can combat and try to fight groupthink within our organization. So characteristics of group decision makers. So sometimes they're less efficient. Their size affects their decision quality. They may be too confident, and then ultimately knowledge counts. So the decision-making accuracy is higher when group members know a good deal about the relevant issues. It's also higher when a group leader has the accountability or has the ability to weigh members' opinions. So depending on whether the group members know or don't know one another, this kind of knowledge can really also affect when going in to an organization or to a group team when making decisions. So group problem solving techniques when reaching for consensus. So for achieving consensus, use active listening skills, involve as many members as possible, seek out the reasons behind arguments, and dig for facts. The don'ts for achieving consensus: so avoid horse trading and making agreements simply not to rock the boat, and then don't try to achieve consensus by putting questions to a vote. Okay, so those are some ways that we can actually work to be more effective within our organization and discourage that groupthink. More problem-solving techniques: so brainstorming, devil's advocacy, the dialect method, and then post-project mortem. So I encourage you to read up on those a little bit in terms of what those problem-solving techniques can do. I think most of you can probably figure out what they mean just based off of their phrasing and wording. Figure 7.7, taking a look at that on page 303. You can take a look at the devil's advocacy method and the dialect method, just some of the steps for both of those. And then ultimately, we take a look with 7.8 in your career corner. So making sure you read through those and go through those. All right. Finally, as we take a look here, as we close out the chapter, just some things to look out for. So, the rational decision-making model. What are those 4 stages? What are those assumptions that make it unrealistic? What are the 7 implementation principles for evidence-based decision-making? Consider that. What are some of the benefits of AI? What are some of the drawbacks? What are the four general decision-making styles in an organization? What does it mean to go with your gut? What are some reasons why CEO firings have increased due to ethical lapses? Think about how big data can be used within the levels of management. Think about, what does it mean? What does artificial intelligence mean? Um, you know, Take a look at the decision making, the four types of decision making. What are the characteristics of those? Take a look at some of the different biases and how some of those biases. What are some of those biases? Um, Take a look at groupthink, be able to understand that. And then there are two individuals that you should look up. Ursula Burns and Howard Schultz are two individuals I think you would do well to look up a little bit more in depth this week. So that brings us to the end of chapter 7 lecture. If you guys have more questions, obviously, you know where to find me. Thank you and have a great rest of your morning, day, or afternoon, depending on whenever you are listening to this.